We are back on Morning Line. Our guest is Clint Kelly, malpractice attorney. We were talking about a number of different things that may come up on cases. We talked about it obviously when the pandemic started, the whole issue of COVID, the focus on COVID maybe sometimes, and as a result, other conditions not being dealt with. Right. Of course, you've told me about how doctors to some degree are protected against lawsuits when it comes to COVID.
Well, they're not just to some extent, they are fully protected.
I know. Now, you're involved in some of these cases that originated before these laws passed with some of these nursing homes that had issues,
correct,
right?
Gallatin, that's right.
Now, that's still pending. It was already filed before, but then there was action taken by the legislature that what?
Correct. Well, at the time that we had the Gallatin cases before we filed suit, we were given a heads up by people in the government that we needed to send our pre-suit notice by a certain date to be grandfathered in. And then after that, they changed the law and provided COVID immunity to all healthcare providers. So if any healthcare provider is diagnosing and treating COVID, if the patient dies from COVID or from that treatment related to COVID, you have immunity unless you can prove gross negligence or reckless conduct by clear and convincing evidence, which means forget it, you're not going to prove it.
Now, is that a bad thing? As I sit here hearing this, and I know you're going to hit me with it, but it's kind of like, COVID's new. They're doing what
It's not new anymore.
Okay, it's not new anymore, but I mean...
This law is still in effect, Nick. It was supposed to sunset, and it keeps getting renewed. We're long past now being new. They know exactly how to treat it, but we still have this immunity.
Okay, but you're still not immune if it's gross negligence, but you say that's very hard to prove. What could come up that would be a mistake that would be actionable if this law wasn't in place? That they didn't act quickly enough to put you on a certain type of med that's supposed to reduce the symptoms?
What if the ventilator settings are wrong?
Okay.
That's a good
and you
example. Suffocate to death.
Okay, so we have ventilators sometimes you're put on very serious.
Correct.
And they mess up.
What if they don't monitor you correctly?
Why would call that gross negligence?
Well, if the settings, you'd be surprised what can be justified, or there's a difference between what, I mean, jurors call it an honest mistake versus someone who's reckless. I mean, in other words, on one side of the spectrum, you've got Nurse Vaught, right?
Yeah,
the most reckless
you know
that you can
case
think
that we covered, yes.
And then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got what we call the honest mistake. Everybody's human kind of thing. It you know, is a slip up, you know, a momentary lapse of judgment. That's on the other end of the spectrum, and somewhere in between is where the case falls. The closer you get to Nurse Vaught, the more likely you are to win your case with a jury, which means you'll settle it.
Okay. The
closer you get on the other end of the honest mistake or lapse situation, the less likely you are to win the case with a jury, and the more likely you are you're going to have to try it, that you won't get a settlement. That's the spectrum. Where the COVID immunity law, it puts it where you got to prove this all the way over here with Nurse Vaught, or you got no case at all. You can't even, your case can't even get to a jury. So I'm critical because we're now 2.5 years into COVID. Healthcare providers know how to treat this. And what disturbs me more is the fact that an argument can be made that you may come in with symptoms of COVID, but something else happens to you. Say you develop a blood clot. Pulmonary embolism. A blood clot is, pulmonary embolism is a blood clot that runs up your leg into your lungs, cuts off blood flow to your heart. It can kill you. Okay? May have nothing to do with the COVID. Maybe just you're set up to get a blood clot. You sue because they failed to properly heparinize you or thin your blood to prevent the blood clot. Hospital comes in and says, no, we were treating COVID. We're entitled to COVID immunity. And there's not any law out there right now, judge-made law, to decide where we are on that. In other words, the hospital can make a good argument, the patient can make a good argument, and I don't know how it would turn out because it's just, there have been no cases on that. But that's how broadly you can read that law. The law needs to be lifted. It's enough's enough.
It's just in Tennessee, right? And there may be other states that pass similar, but
there are other states, but there are a lot of states that don't have this.
Would you imagine under this law there have been some cases that have not been, you know, gone after by attorneys like you because they're protected? Have there been? Do you know of some where it's like
I just turned one down last week
that you might have had
Michelle
a case?
Sent me an email, said, does this lawyer not know about the COVID immunity bill? Because it was a COVID case. It was a case where a patient came in and the allegation was the COVID management was mishandled. So yeah, we know about it, and we've turned down cases numerous times because you can't win them.
No, but your point is right. I can understand why this was in place initially early on when we didn't know much. Now I know COVID keeps kind of changing or whatever, but we know now much, much more. I don't see how a law like this should be on the books.
To use the phrase you're very familiar with now, we know the standard of care.
Yeah, we know the standard of care for this.
To COVID and COVID management. Why don't we have laws in place that simply say, follow the standard of care, and if you don't, you're going to have to answer for it in court if somebody gets hurt badly, rather than you follow this, you don't follow the standard of care, we're going to immunize you anyway.
You also wonder too, the long haul COVID folks, and you were talking about the blood clot. I could see how some hospitals now could say, well, we don't know. There's so many things that come after COVID. We can't say that blood clot wasn't the result of COVID. Or I know someone who's having heart issues now, and now that may have happened anyway, but this person had COVID. Now they're saying, well, it could be COVID related, and it might be.
Now you get in uncharted waters there.
It is uncharted waters. That's what I was going to say.
I think the bigger issue, though, is you're in the hospital. You got there, okay? You're alive. You're getting treatment, and something else goes wrong that's arguably unrelated to the COVID. You're there in the hospital. That I guess you could say is COVID related, but the actual treatment or what they're doing is something that's different. The condition perhaps is different from COVID, and it's a terrible mistake, negligence. And the hospital says, doesn't matter, it all goes within the COVID immunity, and so you got no case. I hate immunity bills because I don't like the law. I don't like government telling you, we're going to shut the courthouse doors on you in some instances because we want to protect a certain class of healthcare providers. I don't like that.
And I think that piggybacks on what I've asked you about before. You mentioned Redonda Vaught, and my understanding is next legislative session, she or maybe some who saw what happened to her, and she was the nurse at Vanderbilt with the issue on the meds that led to the death of a patient. Qualified immunity, they want to pass something like that.
Wanted to pass qualified immunity.
Wanted to pass it. Has not passed, and it may be brought up next legislative session to talk about how to protect nurses from being sued for making honest mistakes,
being prosecuted.
Yeah.
But it could be used also. They could parlay it into a civil immunity bill. I mean,
accountability is important.
It is, and bad facts make bad laws, and that's the problem here. Is she's a one-off. You don't want to use it to deprive patients of their ability to hold healthcare providers accountable. We're all patients. Everybody goes to the doctor, who's watching this show.
Sure.
Do you want to lose another right? I mean, how many rights are we going to have to give up to the point where we're basically helpless? We just have to go in there and take whatever we can get.
Yeah, and if it goes wrong, nothing you can do about it.
That's not conservative. That's not free market. That's just the government telling you, hey, we're going to take this away from you too.
Well, you remember the outrage among so many nurses, in my opinion, some of the nurses that didn't look very closely at the Vaught case, but so many, and they thought the fallout after the fact would be that a lot of people got out of the nursing business, and there's a lot of reasons why people maybe left nursing over the last pandemic. What do you think? Was there much fallout after that verdict in the Vaught case?
I can't prove it. I don't know what to tell you.
I don't know that there was. I mean, I think nurses maybe were leaving for a while anyway because of the horrible burden they had to deal with the pandemic, which I sympathize with.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
But I'm not sure.
What about the other factors such as burnout?
Oh, yeah. The nurses are under a lot of stress.
Overworked.
Yes.
How much of that, and then this comes along and just kind of a sort of a,
it was on top of everything else.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Which it was a lot at once. So I understand the reaction
just
from nurses.
Just an aside, I was in Montreal last week. Huh? Canadian nurses are about to go on strike because they have a government-run healthcare system. It's completely government paid.
Yeah, right.
They're arguing they're not getting paid enough. Same things there that are happening here: burnout, overworked. COVID's just driven them crazy. The difference is here. It's a free market system, but the nurses here, they're not unionized. They don't have any rights like the ones in Canada. In Canada, if they shut down, there is no health care. So they're negotiating with the government to raise their salaries. But that's where Nurse Vaught didn't have anything to do with what's going on there. They're just burned out.
Yeah, that's what I think. And you've said before, when it comes to a lot of your cases, nurses are some of the most valuable people that you deal with. I mean,
the hardest working.
They're hardest working. The nurses I've dealt with are just terrific. Yeah. But I mean, they also sometimes can be the key to your cases.
They're more likely to tell me.
Really? Like that one nurse that called you. What do you mean? Just because of what they see? Are they willing to go on the record, or are they usually just pointing you in the right direction?
They're more likely to disclose more so than physicians. That makes sense.
Yeah. All right. We'll be back with our final segment with Clint Kelly right after this.